My name is Andretta, and I serve as Executive Director of the Center for Social Justice Research, Teaching, and Service here at Georgetown University. And I want to welcome you to our homecoming showcase of Global Social Justice Research, which is sponsored by the Center for Social Justice, CSJ, by the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and by GOFAR, the Georgetown Office for Fellowships and Research. Many thanks to my colleagues at the CSJ and the Berkley Center, especially Amanda, Sarah, and Aaron for helping pull together this event today. Also, thank you very much today to our students and alumni presenters. I really appreciate the time, effort, and energy you took not only to do your projects, but also to share them with us today. So today, that's why we're here. We want to highlight some of the important research work that's going on by our students and recent graduates around issues of social justice around the world. We also hope that the presentations act as inspirations for current students who want to apply to some of the projects, to some of the awards that you will hear about today. And as we go through the presentations, I'll try to make some mention of what those awards are and maybe when some of the due dates are for some of our current students. So we really hope that we get great students applying to these awards and thinking about how they're integrating summer work in the social justice realm into their overall Georgetown experience. So each presentation will run about 8 minutes. I will be keeping track of time, so presenters, make sure you look at me in the front row. And then at the end of all 4 presentations, we'll have our presenters at the front of the room for question and answers and dialogue. I think I heard that the speakers need to switch out microphones. Is that right, in between sessions? So we just might have a minute in between presentations in order to do that. So without further ado, we are going to start with our first presentation, which is Phil Wong and Phil Deering. Phil Wong is a student in the SFS, and Phil Deering is a student in the college. And the two Phils, as they are widely known on campus, were award recipients of the 100 Projects for Peace Award, which is administered through the Center for Social Justice. This award is made possible through the Davis Foundation and in the legacy of Catherine Davis, who, to celebrate her 100th birthday, wanted to give out, I believe, $110,000 grants for students to be able to work for peace in the world. So Georgetown has been able to actually allocate a couple summers worth of these grants, and we even have another 100 Projects for Peace alumni recipient in the room, Maggie Ferrato back there. So Phil and Phil spent their summer in Rwanda. So that is the first place where we are going to go on our travels today. And just to let you know, this award application is available right now through Hoya Link, through CSJ's Hoya Link page. And a note to seniors, seniors are allowed to apply for this award. It is a $10,000 award, and if memory serves me correct, the application deadline is Friday, November 21st. And we have several info sessions about this particular award, and you can see the information on those dates in the call for applications on Hoya Links, or you can talk to my colleague Amanda Monroe here from the CSJ. So without further ado, Phil and Phil, please.
All right, so as Dr. Whistler mentioned, I'm Phil Deering. This is Phil Wong. We are seniors. We have been roommates since freshman year. So first of all, before we get into sort of talking about what we did this summer, I just wanted to say a few quick thanks. Huge thank, first of all, to the Ferrato twins for helping us initially. When we were thinking about applying, we reached out. They were really helpful. Thank you to all of our friends that sort of encouraged the project. Huge thanks to Amanda Monroe, who sort of guided us through when we had a lot of doubts and challenges through the whole process. She held us steady. And then, of course, to Dr. Whistler and the rest of the CSJ staff. This is a wonderful event, and we're really excited to speak here today. So without further ado, we're going to take it away and sort of talk about our summer.
Yeah, so to give you a bit of background, I actually spent the summer of 2013 in Rwanda. And I was with a program that was 8 weeks long and didn't allow us to put any sort of resources into our project. So while it was a great experience for personal development, I left feeling a little bit unfulfilled. Studied abroad, came back, and we saw an advertisement for the 100 Projects for Peace grant. And Phil and I, as roommates, thought that this would be a really great opportunity to collaborate on an issue that we were both passionate about, and we decided to apply.
Right, so when looking to try and figure out what we actually wanted to work on there were two issues that really stuck out to Phil, and then as we were looking more into it, that really struck home with us. So as you can see here, they were respiratory health and then deforestation. So in Rwanda, currently, over the past 20 years, 37% of the forestry has been destroyed. So a giant deforestation issue, largely the result of increased settlement, increased population. Population is going to double by 2050 in Rwanda. So this problem is only going to get worse. And similarly, respiratory health, as you can see with this kitchen where they're going indoors, is a huge issue. It's the second leading cause of death in Rwanda. So we tried to think about it, and while Rwanda's economy is ticking along and there are great strides in that regard, it's not enough, it's not fast enough. So what could be done in the meanwhile to bridge that gap? And so we basically decided that clean cook stoves could be a great way to sort of bridge towards that future.
And so we poured over reams and reams of clean cook stove literature from the comforts of our Neville's apartment. And what we settled on was, at the time, what we thought was a good idea. So we decided to work with the Philips smokeless stove, which is a pellet fuel stove. As its name suggests, that means it takes condensed pellet fuel from typically wood and use it as its fuel. And so it's a super efficient combustion. Having said that, that means that it's more expensive than most rural Rwandans can afford. We sort of conveniently brushed over this warning sign, which certainly later came to bite us back. But then we also settled on, later on, we settled on this more locally produced cook stove, which is called the Chanarumwe, and that's something that Phil's going to talk about in greater detail.
Yeah, so we came in with this plan. We worked really, really hard to figure out the best way to do this. We paired it with an education curriculum. Amanda knows we spent hours and hours figuring out exactly what to do. And then within a week, meeting with people in Kigali, looking at things, we realized, wait a second, this isn't the right thing to do. And so we completely changed tracks within the first week of being in Rwanda and transitioned over to this project. Now, why? Why are these different? Let me go back. Okay. Here you see it looks very, very foreign. We call this like a policy-driven stove. Something that is used, it's a really cool initiative where they take carbon credits from Europe to pay for it. They give out these stoves for free. It's really interesting. The problem, though, is that as a result of this, the usage rates are really, really low. And no one actually adopts it because someone just shows up on their doorstep with a stove. Alternatively, this program, the Chanarumwe program, is not well advertised. They don't have a lot of funding. And that's why we didn't even know about it until we showed up. There's nothing really online. And so the difference, though, is that if you look at it, this is a stove we installed. It's organic. It fits in the kitchen, right? So people are actually willing to use it. Usage rates are way higher. And the addition is that they're produced locally in the country. They help economically, and people really buy into the process a lot more. And so basically we decided to work with this Chanarumwe project, primarily through an SNV, which is a Dutch development organization that worked closely with the Rwandan government to really forward this progress. So we have two main aspects to our project. One, we worked on a short messaging system texting platform, which is here. So the government worked with, so basically looking at this, we worked with the SMS platform, and then we also worked in the community, and that's what Phil's going to talk about for a second.
Right, so after our first week in Kigali, we moved out to Bagana in Munyiginya sector in Eastern Province. And so this is a very small rural community in Rwanda, about 1,000 families there. And that's where the bulk of our work took place. So we had this previously agreed partnership with the president of the local health cooperative. So this is a man who oversees the health cooperative for 6 communities in the area. And he had some experience working with health stoves in the community, whereas he knew that we had funding coming in, and so we were looking forward to a very fruitful partnership.
And so far this seems like a peachy story, but there were some warning signs that we didn't quite realize at the time. So we came in with this pragmatic outset, like that we wanted to go and make a giant difference in our 3 months. And it's true, 3 months is more time than Phil had, but 3 months is still very, very little time. So that, in addition to our $10,000 that we were coming in, high rollers, like that really almost set us up. This combination of funding and the short time really put us in a bind. It led us towards taking an approach that was opposite to the principles of the Davis Foundation for Peace, building a durable peace. And so we'll sort of explain why that is.
So we basically saw this commercial supply chain as an opportunity to rethink some of the structures that contributed to financial inequality in the community. This here is a picture of the cell office, that's sort of the municipal building in the village. But what we quickly realized was that basically here we have the Mason, who we quickly fell into cohorts with, and the president. So the president didn't have a whole lot of time, but he wanted to be involved in most aspects of our project. This is a man very competent, president of the Health Cooperative, so had a lot of knowledge on health issues. But here was the Mason, who had a ton of time, really. He was a singer in the church choir, a subsistence farmer, and so he wasn't really doing a whole lot in his spare time. Obviously, he was tending to his family, and that's a huge commitment. But what we found was, since the president was so busy, we really ended up working more so with the Mason, who had experience with making things, working with his hands in a fashion that the president didn't have as much.
And so at this point, we were really proud of ourselves. So we were working with this guy, exploring different types of stoves, how to really get it in the community. It was a great relationship. We really felt like we were moving forward. We even linked up our partners in Kigali, SNV, with him and different people. And everything was going great until suddenly the president walks up to us and says, "I'm sick of you. You've been working with other people. I never want to work with you again."
So that was obviously a bit of a roadblock for us, I guess you could say. And I think it points to several issues. One is that we didn't have as clear communication as we would have wanted to. Now, this was partly because of the time constraints of the president, but also it's a reality of working in a foreign setting where you're going through a translator, and it's frankly tough to have these very comprehensive meetings that can span several hours, and they're really, really tiresome for all parties involved. The next slide. So we eventually reconciled with the health president, or the health cooperative president, and agreed to do a training to install and retail these cook stoves, as well as to talk about what sort of language community members could use when discussing this cook stove. So here we have our good friend who's doing the training. She's from Kigali. And this was in a household where basically there's the kitchen and you install the clay cook stove in sort of a mud fixture.
And so in the end, there were a lot of bumps in the road, a lot of things that really challenged us. We had to move out to different retailers. It was definitely a process. But eventually we got the blessing of the health cooperative and the president to work, and we worked to disseminate 64 stoves to low-income families, along with creating a market in the community to retail them for about 2,500 francs, which is $3.50 or so. And then in Kigali, so those are the stoves.
And so one of the difficulties that we found was sort of the momentum that would be driving this project, right? So on the one hand, there were supposed to be marketers or mobilizers who were raising awareness about the cook stove, its benefits in the community, but that was obviously very centralized within the health cooperative. And on the other hand, once those cook stoves were bought, because, when we were walking around, granted we have this position as foreigners, a lot of people were telling us, we want this cook stove. Then the health cooperative would have to organize these installations. So it was really a multi-part process, which is pretty difficult to navigate, frankly, when these people are working in fields for 9 hours out of the day and maybe tending to their cows, tending to their children for the remainder of it.
Right. And so with those challenges, we ultimately did the best that we could. And then in Kigali, we set up the SMS platform and have been working with them since to make sure that it's piloted and successful. So really quickly, to recap, some lessons that we learned.
Yeah, so basically, talk with people on the ground before you go. I can't emphasize this enough. I obviously had experience in the country, but not specifically in the cook stove literature, and things change fairly quickly on the ground. So it's really important to be very close to that. We talked with a lot of experts in the community here and really explored the online cook stove literature, but that can only tell you so much when things are happening in Rwanda.
And then the main other goal that we really took out was to set realistic goals. So we were so idealistic, so optimistic that we tried to do way too much. And as a result, we ended up spreading ourselves a little thin and not accomplishing as much as we might have if we had kept very focused, defined, narrow goals.
And so I think the ultimate takeaway is that we had this great 3 months in Rwanda, but for very meaningful involvement in a foreign setting, 3 months is a great start, but it is just that, it's a start.
So if anyone has questions about this or wants to talk, we can talk after the presentation, but thank you very much for listening to us. And
swapping of microphones in the back. Our next speaker is Andretta, and she is a senior in the college. And she was one of our 4 Education and Social Justice Summer Research Fellows this past summer. This is a program through the Berkley Center, and it's supported by the Center for Social Justice. And Kendra was spending her time in Bangladesh, and she's going to bring us there through her presentation now.
So good afternoon, everyone. As Dr. Whistler said, my name is Kendra Layton, and I'm a senior this year studying Spanish and education. And I had the privilege of spending a month this summer in Bangladesh with Caritas, which is the second largest NGO in the country, and it's older than the country itself. But first, I'd like to thank Dr. Whistler and the Center for Social Justice for hosting this event, as well as Erin Shevlin from the Berkley Center for seeing me through all stages of this project, as well as Rodney Jacobs, who provided the funding for this. And some of my fellow ESJ fellows who are here today, and our report will be coming out in December, so you can all look forward to that. And last but not least, I'd like to thank my generous hosts at Caritas, Dr. Alo and Anita, who showed me the universal love that's really embodied in their name. So to be honest, I had never been to Bangladesh before. I'm a Spanish major. I want to go into education here. And so I got on the ground and I said, I am a fish out of water. I'd never even been to Southeast Asia. And this is kind of a picture of what I saw outside my window. I heard the sounds of rickshaw bells and heard people speaking and chattering in Bengali and heard the call to prayer 5 times a day. And it was completely new to me. But in my 4 weeks, I learned to eat with my hands. I had countless conversations with people, and I actually traveled to 2 rural regions of Bangladesh, which is what my research focuses on today. So while Caritas, they focus mainly on disaster management and relief and rehabilitation, they also look at more holistic social welfare and development. And part of that they see is education. And some of their educational projects I researched while I was there include the Notre Dame Literacy School for Children of the Slums, which supports over 1,000 students in Dhaka who come from the slums, run by nuns and other teachers there. I also looked at Mirpur Agricultural Workshop and Technical School, so looking at the dynamics of technical and vocational education. And then I also looked at the Alagore Lighthouse Project, which is in the rural regions of Bangladesh, working with predominantly indigenous students. So for today, I just want to focus on that when I went to Bangladesh, I assumed that it was relatively linguistically and ethnically homogenous, but that was far from the truth. I found that there are over 45 indigenous tribes, and they make up over 2% of the population. And so 2 challenges specifically that are facing them are their linguistic and cultural diversity and their geographic isolation, among others. So tracing its origins back to the Liberation War of 1971, the Bengali language movement was a large component of that, where in order to separate themselves from Pakistan, they emphasized Bengali as the language of government and the press and education. And so now, in present-day Bangladesh, the indigenous languages are not very well recognized nor appreciated. Secondly is their geographic isolation. So in interviewing one of the program officers for this project, she mentioned that people are living beside a remote place like a hill or beside a river, and so it's really hard to reach this government infrastructure to these areas. So my research focused on how Caritas is addressing these two challenges. And one of the ways is through the Alagor Lighthouse Project, which is under the Supporting the Hardest to Reach Through Basic Education. So in my experience, I traveled to Rajshahi and Sylhet, which are both India on either side, but it put into perspective the hardest to reach. We literally went on an 8-hour bus ride across a river, on a rickshaw, with a donkey, any type of vehicle that you can imagine. I probably took it to arrive at this little one-room schoolhouse. And this project is made possible through negotiations with the European Union for 10 million euros. They have over 1,000 educational centers in 6 rural regions of Bangladesh. Dhaka, the capital, is right here in the center, and they are addressing the rural regions. They have over 60,000 students, and 43% of those come from ethnic communities. So firstly, how are they bridging the geographic divide? So as I said before, Maya Rashid said it was difficult to get government resources there. So if the community could find a building like this one, then Caritas would support the teacher and the resources there. And so this is an example of when I went to Kuchaibari Educational Center, and it's just this one-room schoolhouse. They have a multi-grade approach where the amazing teacher had the second graders on the rug doing their math, the first graders at the tables practicing their letters. And for someone who wants to be a teacher myself, this was a feat that was amazing. And so firstly, in bridging the geographic divide is actually the establishing of these centers in the rural regions. Secondly is bridging the linguistic divide. So Caritas has taken it upon themselves to develop multilingual education materials in 8 indigenous languages, Shantali, Urao, Kashia, and here's a photo from their launching ceremony of those materials in Dhaka in February. And there's students from all these different communities receiving materials in their language. And Dr. Benedict de Rosario, who's the executive director, said, "Education is a right, and education in a mother tongue is also a right, and we are committed to promote and protect these rights side by side with the government." So in a question of social justice, this is access to education in their mother tongue. And secondly would be bilingual education in the classroom. So all the teachers I met would be fluent in both Kashia and Bengali, or whatever language their students spoke. And they would seamlessly transition from one to the other. So when I was there, we would share songs and dance. I taught them head, shoulders, knees, and toes. We'd first do it in English, then in Bengali, and then in their native tongue. And something funny that I learned there was that I was reading some of the documents about Alagor, and it said da-da-da-da-da, Kendra, my name. And I said, why is my name in these documents? They said, oh, that means center. So Kendro, I found, has another meaning. And that brings me to what is in a name? What's in the name of Alagor? Alagor, lighthouse. So Alo means light, Gor means house. It's symbolic. We're like light bearers. We provide light of education where there is darkness. So for the students who would either have no access to education without facilities there, or who would be working in their rice plantations with their parents, these centers are giving them the opportunity to have an education. And most importantly, as a social justice issue, is cultural recognition and revitalization. So in interviewing these teachers at the Lamapunji Educational Center, they told me the most important thing is to keep alive the Kashi culture. If we don't practice it, it will disappear. And that's why it's very important to study the Kashi language. So my takeaways from that were, 1, to be light bearers of education, and 2, to recognize cultures. And so someone who hopes to go into bilingual education myself, this was a really inspiring opportunity, and I'm very grateful to have had it. So thank you very much.
So as Kendra mentioned, she was one of 4 education and social justice summer research fellows to be out in the field this past summer. Hopi Fink, who is here, was in Burkina Faso, Adam Barton was in Brazil, and Gianna Mehta, who's also here, was in Nicaragua. The 4 of them will also have a presentation night probably in January, and their written and online report will come out hopefully in December. Students who are interested in applying for that fellowship, I encourage you to talk to Erin Shevlin. She is in the back, Erin, and look for those application materials to be published later this semester. So now we are going to turn to Senegal with Elaine Colligan's report from there. Elaine is a senior in the School of Foreign Service, and she had the David Andretta Summer Research Fellowship. This research fellowship is named in honor of David Andretta, who was a graduate of Georgetown, both of the college and of the Medical Center, and the son of Dr. Betty Andretta, who was one of the associate deans in the School of Foreign Service and also taught in multiple programs, including culture and politics and justice and peace. Unfortunately, Dr. Andretta couldn't be here today, but we are very happy to have David's father here with us. So thank you very much for being here. To support the Andretta family in honoring the legacy of their son through this particular fellowship. Elaine, thanks. Yeah.
Hello. Good afternoon. My name is Elaine Colligan, and I am a senior in the School of Foreign Service, studying culture and politics and justice and peace. And I'm so honored to present for you today my summer research in Senegal. It was so generously funded by the Andretta Fellowship, which, as Dr. Whistler mentioned, was created in honor of Georgetown alum David Andretta by his family, and I thank so much their family for their support. I'd also like to thank my research mentors, Dr. Mark Giordano and Dr. Patricia Bermayer-Genzano, and my presentation today explains the summer research that I conducted in a small fishing village in Senegal on gender and sustainability. But before I get into that, I want to explain why I was interested in gender and the environment in developing countries in the first place, and how these two things are even connected. And then I'll explain my research design and methodology, my initial results, and give some key takeaways before answering questions after all the presentations. So by this point in time, most Americans are familiar with climate change. We hear a lot about it in relation to things like Hurricane Sandy happening more. But actually, global climate change is a daily reality for the 1.2 billion people living at or below the poverty line in the developing world. And this is a photo of my host sister who would land in that income group walking in a deforested mangrove plain near the village. This is a photo of fishermen's children whose parents rely on the local ecosystem for their daily bread, and fish, their only source of income. So scholars have picked up on this. They've noticed that not all people in primary resource-dependent communities are affected by climate change in the same way, however. Women and men suffer differently from climate-related stress. This is because women and men have different social statuses, daily tasks, and sources of income. When primary natural resources degrade, or the environment in general becomes less hospitable to human life, women's daily chores and income-earning activities become harder, and the difficulty of subsisting without education, financial resources, or the social status men have is substantial. So it sounds believable, right? Then why did I put problematizing on my slide? It's because this narrative is quite monolithic now in the gender and sustainability discourse, and it's applied in broad terms to a variety of different development programs. So that ubiquity worried me a little bit. It's also a theory that doesn't account for local dynamics and local interpretations of gender and gendered roles, or allow voices from the ground to really penetrate into that narrative and weigh in on the issue. I wondered what the theory was missing, and I also wondered how the theory would account for solutions. So, my research questions are as following. Does the standard gender and sustainability narrative describe how climate change differently impacts men and women in Dirnda, my case study community? What's accurate about this theory and what is missing? And what can a grounded theory add to this narrative in response? And what are opportunities to improve the local environment, economy, and quality of life for women and men in Dirnda? To investigate these questions, I went back to Senegal, where I studied abroad. And this is a country, it's actually the westernmost country in West Africa that was the home of the French colonial empire. And though I studied in Dakar, you can see where that red target is. Though I studied in Dakar, I went to Dirnda, which is a community of about 2,000 people in a delta region of Senegal. And Andretta is an island community, like I said, where men primarily engage in a variety of fishing activities. There are over 20 different species of fish, though there used to be over 45, apparently, before climate change really wreaked havoc on that local ecosystem. And men often go out to sea for 7 to 10 days at a time to pull in a decent catch. Even small boys learn how to fish. Women, on the other hand, buy this fish from men and descale it, process it, and smoke it for local consumption or export to places as far away as China. This is a fish oven in Andretta, and again, that's my host sister, Bella. Besides this, women are constantly on the hunt for bivalves, such as oysters and mussels. These seafood live in the mangrove forest, which is the heart of the local ecosystem and economy. It's very difficult to harvest them. You can see what hard work it is to bend down for hours at a time and pull oysters manually off mangrove roots. After women harvest these seafood, they process them by cooking, drying, or canning them for sale. This takes a number of days, and it's difficult with the time constraints of having to care for children and livestock, cook, clean, and perform other activities and chores, such as chopping firewood, grinding millet to make couscous, and making bread and fried dough for sale. So now that you have an idea about the local economy and the gendered roles that women and men play in that local economy, I want to go into my participatory action research methodology. So I collaborated with a man called Babakar Chor, who's here in the blue shirt, and designed a research methodology once I got into the community. Participatory action research holds as its basic belief that research should be used for social justice aims and should not import already formed ideas about what's important or what questions are important to answer, but rather take the community as co-researchers and develop a research design on the ground. Therefore, Babakar and I decided that we would together complete a series of mapping activities to better understand the troubles that the local community faces. Note here that I personally put a photo of women and men in my participatory research action component of the presentation, because after I talked to women in the community and spoke with Babakar Chor about my gender lens, I overheard men in the community saying, "Oh, they tubab," which means, "Oh, the white people. They always work with women." So after I overheard this, I realized that it would be much more interesting to examine how gender and the environment impact both men and women's levels of economic sustainability and well-being in this community, instead of just focusing on a core group of women. And the men responded very positively to that. So here's a photo of Mer Awa, and she was mapping out the economic difficulties she faces with honey making. And this is Mir Amitur mapping out a women's fishing group that gets together to process fish collectively. And here's a photo of Mamadou, who is a seasoned fisherman. He was one of the oldest fishermen in the community, and he gave me one of the best individual interviews that really linked how fish stocks have dwindled, how the mangrove forest has been deforested with drought and erratic rainfalls over the years, and how that's impacted the community's life. So I'm still coding my research from the summer. There's about 20 hours of interviews, and that takes a while. But here's a graph of my initial conclusions. So you can see that on the left-hand side, the same 5 environmental factors are listed: mangrove deforestation, rising salinity, rough ocean currents, erratic rainfall, and high temperatures. And all of these factors have to do with climate change on the local level. For men, there are different series of health impacts and also economic impacts that mostly result in financial stress and unemployment and less ability to work. Whereas for women, all of this is also true, but a variety of economic activities are impacted. It's not just fishing for women. It's making honey. It's processing fish. It's gathering bivalves. It's also cutting and chopping firewood. It's gathering water. So that generates increased time burdens for women, and also a loss of profits that would go directly to the children because of their gendered roles. So here's a photo of one of my many gender analysis charts. The letters represent the months of the year, and the green and red lines represent the tasks of men and women. Women are at the top and men are at the bottom. And this graph was was confirmed to be pretty much true by men and women in the community. And as you can see, women's time burdens over the year are generally more diverse and heavier than men's, although men and women both work all the time. So what I discovered is that although men only engage in one economic activity, that brings in much more money to the family than women who engage in a variety of economic activities. But when resources degrade, the entire poverty level of the entire family is impacted by the men's inability to bring in money. However, women's activities which don't bring in money but which are crucial for the family's health are also impacted. So, what can we take away from this? In terms of a grounded theory, I found that women and men do have differential vulnerability to climate change, but the narrative that women are victims of climate change more than men and suffer more than men from climate change, I think obscures this differential aspect, because both men and women suffer. And it's not true that men don't want to help their children or keep all the money that they bring in for themselves. I also thought that it would be better, instead of focusing on supporting women to better process fish or to better gather clams from the local mangrove forest, to think about how men and women can work together to both conserve the environment and bring in and strengthen the economic supply chain for their families. So how can we do that, and how can we do that and implement ground solutions that come from the actual community? So one example that we talked about in Andretta was the idea of making a fish processing site and market for women in the community. So this could either be funded by the local président de la communauté rurale, which is basically like the local mayor, or I also offered that I would match whatever funding that they found with funding perhaps from a different grant at Georgetown. So the idea is that you create a site where women can transform, process, and sell fish, but the women aren't buying the fish from men without an agreement. There would be an agreement that any fish that the men bring in, a portion of that fish would go to women for at a reduced price so that they could process that and sell that and then bring in more money for their families. And a portion of those revenues would also be kept for investing in reforestation projects and a communal pirogue. So key takeaways. Both men and women suffer from climate change. Women might suffer more immediately and acutely, but men do suffer the loss of potential to meet long-term goals, such as investing in pirogues, in motors, in financial security in their household. And solutions should target both genders. It's not just enough to target women, because as my community demonstrated, that was not a very popular idea. Furthermore, increasing resilience in primary resource-dependent communities is very important, but global climate change is an international social justice issue. And as much as we can improve resilience at the local level, we also need to think about fossil fuel divestment and the green energy transition to achieve social justice and international social justice in the environmental arena. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elaine. Again, Elaine was our Andretta Fellow, and currently our call for applications for this summer's Andretta Fellowship is out. The applications are due on Friday, November 14th, and it's available through CSJ's Hoya Link page online. Specifically, the Andretta Fellowship is for a junior rising senior, so for summer work for that student at that level. So thank you very much. Our final presentation is from our alum of Georgetown, Jordan Denary. And Jordan is an alum of the School of Foreign Service, and after she graduated from Georgetown, she was a Fulbright Fellow in 13-14, in Jordan. And so I want to thank Lauren Tuckley from the GOFAR office for connecting me with Jordan to give this presentation today. Students who are interested in the Fulbright Fellowship opportunity should seek out Lauren. You can raise your hand, great. Or also talk to Jordan. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
a few more thank yous before I talk about my time in Jordan. Again, to the Fellowship's Office and Lauren for all of their help in helping me to apply for Fulbright and get the grant. I also want to thank the faculty members who wrote recommendation letters for me, which were very helpful. Paul Heck, Fida Adli, and Huda Al-Mufti, all teachers of mine here. So in many ways, my Fulbright experience, my Fulbright research began when I studied abroad in Jordan in the spring of 2012, when I, oh, that was my thank you everyone for supporting me in Fulbright slide. I forgot that. So my Fulbright research sort of began when I studied abroad because I lived down the street from these two houses of worship, the King Abdullah Mosque and a Coptic Orthodox church. To me, these two buildings spoke of the long history of Muslim-Christian coexistence in Jordan. This is something that Jordanians are really proud of, and it was symbolized really beautifully in these two buildings, which were right across the street from each other. So from this spot, a cab driver would drop me off, and I would walk down the street to my host family's home. And often when I came in the house, I would find my family watching Christian satellite television in Arabic. So first I was sort of surprised that these kind of channels even existed in a Muslim majority context, that channels for Christians, which are a small portion of the population, would even be on the airwaves. And despite the fact that these channels were done by Arabs and for Arabs and in Arabic, their sentiment and the content that was presented didn't really reflect the harmony that I noticed walking down the street or hearing stories about Muslims and Christians getting along in Jordan. I quickly learned that these channels are beamed in from elsewhere. They're satellite channels, so they might have a base in Cyprus or in Israel and then kind of have the ability to beam across the entire Middle East. So this one program is called El Haya, and that means life. And in this program, Brother Rashid, the host, talks about what he sees as the inherent violence in Islam, or the backwardness of Islam, in an attempt to convert Muslims to Christianity. To me, it doesn't really seem like the best approach. Might not be super successful, but they've claimed that they've converted a lot of people. On that same channel, I saw a program called The Muslim Women, which tries to convince people that Muslim women are oppressed in Islam. These are all things that I was really used to hearing about sort of in a Western context, out of Western media. These are sort of some of the stereotypes and the narratives that we hear on television here or on news outlets. So I was really surprised to find that Jordanian Christians I knew bought into these channels' stereotypical portrayals of Muslims. It made a lot of sense that American Christians here would buy into that kind of portrayal, because a lot of Americans claim to have never met a Muslim. They don't know a lot about Islam. But in Jordan, Christians have Muslim friends, neighbors, and coworkers. So it surprised me that they were so willing to buy into watching these channels. So I had all these questions when I was studying abroad. How many Jordanian Christians actually watched these channels? Were there other channels than the ones that I had seen at my host family's house? Did Muslims watch these channels, or were they at least aware of their existence? And most importantly, how would these channels affect the really strong relationship that Christians and Muslims have in Jordan? How would they shape perceptions? If people were watching these channels at home, would that impact the way they interact in daily life? So I thought, I'm going to apply for Fulbright. That would be a great opportunity for me to come back and think more about this issue. And luckily, with the help of a lot of you in this room, I was able to get that and come back. And upon returning to Jordan, I read a lot about the history of Muslim-Christian relations in the Levant generally. So the kind of the territory of what is now Lebanon, Jordan, Israel-Palestine, Syria, that general area of the Middle East. And I also did a lot of interviews. I spoke with Christian clergy from different denominations. I spoke with Islamic scholars, media experts, other leaders, and they gave me all a pretty similar picture of the past, and some of them called it the Jordanian model. And they talked about how for centuries, Muslim and Christian Arabs lived side by side in the land that is now Jordan, and they had the same language, the same culture, the same history. And the religious identity of your neighbor wasn't of huge concern to you because Christianity and Islam were really both core parts of Arab culture. Jordanians didn't even perceive their interacting as coexisting per se because they were one Arab community that simply lived. It wasn't even living together, they're just living. Christians are a small group. They always have been a smaller portion of the population, but they have never, until very recently, been considered a minority. Even that concept is very foreign to Arab culture. So I heard so many wonderful stories, anecdotes from older folks about the relationship between Muslims and Christians in Jordan. During the Q&A period, I can tell you some of those really wonderful stories. You can just enjoy the pictures for now. There's some really nice folks. And most of my interviewees felt that Muslim-Christian relations in Jordan were still quite good, but they did acknowledge that their grandparents' way, as they put it, of coexisting was slipping away. Today, Muslims and Christians don't always feel like one community like they might have in the past. Religious sectarianism is growing. Before, conflict might have arisen around these two identity factors, nationality if you were a refugee population or if you were an East Banker, as they call Jordanian nationals, or between different tribes. But now religious identity is a bigger factor in people's lives. You sort of have the twin problems of Islamic fundamentalism on one hand and a lot of Christian missionary activity on the other. So I really love this pun. I didn't make it up. Between Iraq and a hard place. Jordan is right in the middle of all this fun stuff. These strains of sectarianism and fundamentalism are really foreign to the Levantine experience, and only very recently did they come to Jordan. In my interview, we cited a lot of different foreign events that had a big impact on raising people's consciousness about religious identity, and we can talk about those in the Q&A potentially also. But everyone I talked to did agree that the media, and particularly religious television, played a big part in bringing these tensions from abroad, for raising people's awareness of religious identity. So some TV channels began to appear in the early 90s, but they didn't become widespread until the last 10 or 15 years. And there's now hundreds of channels, both Christian and Muslim, that can now be found on basic satellite providers. And most of them broadcast from outside of the Levant, from outside of this region, which is interesting. They might broadcast basic like religious material, prayers, songs, sermons, things like that. But also many of them are apologetic. They argue for their particular brand of the faith. And these more extremist channels on both the Christian and Muslim sides kind of indirectly argue with each other over issues and provoke each other. And even though, as I said, these channels are from outside of Jordan, they have a large following within the country. I looked at about a dozen Christian channels. These are logos only, some of them. And I would watch them at home and then talk to my interviewees about them. And one of the most popular was El Haya Life, which I mentioned before. And their programming is solely intended to convert Muslims to Christianity. A lot of my interviewees felt that these programs were too aggressive and that they were destroying some of the bridges between Christians and Muslims. And they said that it only served to cause further backlash against the small Christian community in the region. Muslims were aware of these channels. Sometimes they would watch them because they want to know what bad, I mean, you want to know if people are saying bad things about you, what they're saying, right? There's one of the logos from El Haya. Yeah, interesting, right? So the opposite of El Haya is Noorsat, and this is the only channel that is based inside the Levant. Noor means light, and they were founded in Lebanon and have a branch in Jordan. So I spoke to the head of Noorsat, and she told me that their goal is to really be sort of an antidote to these other channels. There's a range of other channels as well, some which broadcast sermons from megachurches in the US. You have a lot of Coptic channels, things like that. So what's the overall impact? I mean, the channels like Noorsat, which try to build ecumenical understanding, they only seem to be going so far. The other more extremist channels tend to be more popular and have more viewers. And so it's hard to tell how things are being impacted on the ground. I mean, things are still good. There's no violence. Violence is really rare, but attitudes seem to be changing. Under the surface, things are bubbling up. So I really hope, sometimes I feel like I see two Jordans, you know, the one of the postcards and the building side by side, and the other of, you know, ISIS support demonstrations and things like that. So you've got these two really different attitudes in the country. So I hope that that the young people can really maintain the spirit of their grandparents and kind of maintain the spirit of inter-religious hospitality that their grandparents modeled. And I think this will be a really key thing to do to face a lot of Jordan's current challenges, especially those posed by the Christian channels. So thanks for listening to my nine months of research in 9 minutes. So.
Have to write it down. So I'm going to ask our presenters actually to pull up maybe these 5 chairs and take a seat up here. And we would love to open up to the audience the opportunity to ask questions or to make a comment in general or to any of our specific presentations today. And thank you so much, students and alumni, for being with us and for offering your works today. But I will open it up first to anybody in the audience. Yes?
I have a question for the 2 films. So I'm curious about your project that, because I mean the title is the Davis 100 Projects of Peace. And I was wondering what that definition of peace is, because it doesn't seem to have to do anything with conflict necessarily. I was wondering what the projects on the whole look like.
Yeah, so I guess the first major step in like looking at Davis Project for Peace is how do you personally define peace? Because there are a bunch of different definitions out there. I mean, basically, what would you say like our going definition of peace was? We really...
So to kind of build on that, you can see negative peace as sort of an absence of conflict, right? But there's also positive peace, which is addressing some of the more structural barriers to liberty and prosperity. And that is the angle that we took. So there are these issues of deforestation and respiratory health, and those definitely impacts the ability of typically women to lead the life that they want to. And so that was the intent of our project.
Yes?
So it sounds like from most of you guys, you kind of came up with your project ideas during like summer abroad studying. So, but like, where did the genesis of your ideas really come from? Like, while you were studying, like, were you just on the ground looking around for like, you know, olives?
Well, I would say that my experience in Bangladesh, I knew, well, it's the Education Social Justice Research Fellowship, so I knew that I wanted to look at their education projects. So I did a little bit of research on the forefront of what is Caritas already doing to address, but it was hard to find from those documents what's really going on the ground. And so the first day I got there, I met with the executive director there, Dr. Alo, and he told me about their projects. And one that particularly piqued my interest was their project with indigenous populations and the multilingual education materials, because I'm so interested in bilingual education. So from there, they said, oh, would you like to go with us to visit the rural areas, the tea gardens and the mango gardens? And I said, yeah, and so it kind of evolved from there, and then definitely seeing things on the ground. And then I was really struck by what you said about participatory action research and not coming in with knowing all the questions, but rather trying to respond to what's going on the ground and what are the questions that they're asking as well.
And I think I just had read a lot about environmental justice in the United States, about environmental racism in the United States, about problems with gender in the developing world, and I wondered how climate change was actually impacting people on the ground. And after really reading that literature, I noticed this sort of ubiquitous, repeating narrative of women as victims of climate change that I wanted to test.
I talked a little bit about this in my presentation, but when I was a student at Georgetown, and I was very interested in Muslim-Christian relations, and particularly how the Western media portrays Muslims. So when I went to Jordan, I kind of saw that same issue in a different light. It was like how were, in an Arab context, were Muslims being represented by people who are from their same culture but are now living in the US and potentially have different interests. It's sort of something that really fascinated me, and I wanted to spend more time with it.
And for us, I would say the fact that we were roommates is essentially the genesis of this. I mean, so it wasn't as if I was in Rwanda in the summer and said, bingo, here's this huge issue. But I obviously was exposed to it, and when I came back and was sort of processing it with Phil and we were talking it over, it became very apparent, even from just physical descriptions of what Rwanda was like, that here was this very permanent issue.
I would also jump out and say that, it seemed like, so yes, a lot of us, I was never in Rwanda before, I'd never been there before I went there. And I would say it's definitely not a requirement to have studied abroad there and done anything. Like, I think all of us agreed that once you start working on an issue in depth, you learn way more about what, than even if you were in Rwanda for 2 months. And, but spending another 3 months there completely changes perceptions. And so, I guess what I say is don't randomly choose something on the map, but if you have some interests, don't be afraid to just explore them.
I have a question for you. So in terms of the drought, is irrigation involved?
Irrigation is not a possibility because this community does not do any farming anymore. And the types of trees and kind of global scrub brush that they would be cutting for their firewood needs are so remote that they have to walk miles and miles to get them, and it's just not a possibility. 20 years ago, about 25 years ago, it was a farming community, but after the drought in the 70s, I guess 40 years ago, and with increasingly erratic rainfalls, it's just not possible. Thank you.
I have a question for Jordan. So how were things before these satellite channels started to work? Like, what really promoted or kind of encouraged them to broadcast, and what was that exactly? What happened that they became so popular?
Yeah, so I did less research on the origins of these channels and the history of these channels and when they began. There's actually a professor at Middlebury who's writing the first ever book about this. So one of the interesting things about my research is no one has really written about this before. It's very new. These channels, most of them have only started within the last 10 years and have only gone on satellite in maybe even less, a bit more recently than that. So I'm really anxious for this professor's book to come out because I think that'll give us a lot more insights on potentially what the interests of these different television channels are. I'm kind of cynical about the reasons why, especially Westerners are starting these channels that seem to sort of be stirring up issues of religious identity in the Middle East. One of the main issues, or the things, one of the main goals is evangelizing, is bringing people to Christianity for a lot of these channels. But to me, there seem to potentially be some other connections with political or geopolitical goals potentially. I don't know.
I don't know if there's a relation between that and between the Saudi, the Iraqi and Saudi Sunni Shia channels that emerged after 2003. And
Yeah.
they have influenced and impacted the region immensely, actually.
Well, exactly, and so my friend Afaf is from Jordan. We met in Jordan, so it's cool to talk to her about this. But yeah, one of the things that some of my interviewees, especially Muslim interviewees, said to me was, "Why are you researching the Christian channels? The main problem is the Sunni Shia split channels, because you have channels funded from Saudi or other countries, the Gulf countries, and then Iran funding these channels, which really go to war with each other." Over the Sunni Shia issues and stuff. So yeah, a lot of that started not just after the Iraq War, but also I heard in after the '79 revolution in Iran, maybe there weren't satellite television channels then, but the Saudis, after Iran became this power, started pumping money into spreading their ideology, and that's really, I mean, as I'm sure you can see, like that's when this kind of ideology came to Jordan. It wasn't there before. So, thank you.
Did any of your research involve quantitative data collection?
So actually with the SMS platform, which we didn't talk about as much, we were going to do quantitative research by measuring how many people opted into a sort of maintenance arrangement for their stoves via SMS. The idea being that it was really tough to get people out into all these households and ask if they wanted to engage in some sort of maintenance arrangement, and we could achieve that via SMS. But that's hit a bunch of bureaucratic challenges, and we're still trying to work that out.
So this is a question for Elaine and the two Phils. So you two both, all three of you talked about kind of the tension between deforestation and the problem with like firewood and stuff like that. So through your research and your time living in these places, do you guys have any idea of where this is going? How to get people fuel for cooking, for making a livelihood without using wood and these resources that are scarce and really causing problems with deforestation?
Well, one thing that Andretta, which was my welcoming institution, is working on is making biogas out of tallow. And so that's something that is actually very energy efficient. The problem is that it smells bad, and people in the community don't like it. So yeah, that's just a challenge. I think another possibility is working on community reforestation projects. Actually, Berkley has reforested about 20% of the degrading forest, although it's continuing to degrade. So those are two strategies that are being implemented.
And I guess on our side, we actually looked into doing the Rwandan biogas program, but the problem is that even with government subsidies, they're running $800,000. So for an individual or family to afford that is just incredible. Like only the very rich of the rich. So I guess on our scale, the best way to get at deforestation was to reduce fuel usage. So the cook stoves we were using, even those like clay cook stoves, would reduce it by up to 50% the amount they use. And so just that alone, if everyone adopts those, makes a sizable difference.
And I think there are also a couple dynamics at play that complicate this issue. One is that, the people who are bearing the burden of deforestation and respiratory health, it's largely women because they're doing the cooking. Often they have to forage firewood. But on the other hand, if the primary breadwinner is the man in the household, then there's this sort of tension between who can pay for it or who pays for it, who benefits from it, right? But yeah, moving people up the energy ladder, there are also reforestation programs going on in Rwanda, but it's the most densely populated country in continental Africa, so it faces a lot of challenges.
My question is for the two Phils, but generally for everybody. How did you follow up with your project in the country that you were doing? For your project in particular, you have to keep the ball rolling and serve even more people. Who carries on your work in your communities? And for the others, if you had any work that was left incomplete in those places, did you designate anybody who continued your work, or how did the work carry on?
Yeah, so the idea for our project was from the start to take more of a facilitating role rather than very hands-on leadership. So the president of Health Cooperative was initially the person who could have really taken the initiative. Now, after we left, it turned out that there was actually another local entrepreneur who was very interested in assuming the mantle for this project. So he's the primary point for that right now. Now, I have some contacts and friends in the region from my work last summer, and also from this summer, so that's the primary way to stay in contact. The NGO in Kigali is a little bit easier because they have access to email.
Yeah, but all that being said, it's ultimately out of our hands for now, because we can get updates and we can check in with people, but ultimately it's derivative from other people sort of following through. And that's actually been really tough, for at least me, to have to spending so much time and effort there and then just sitting back and just hoping that it works out.
But I think it's also part of recognition that this project is not about us. It's not
Anyone else want to answer that question?
Well, I'd say, so my approach going in was never to come up with the answers for anything, but rather learn as much as I could about it. And so something I didn't address in my presentation today is the sustainability of some of these projects, like GOFAR. So the funding is coming from the European Union, and they had originally said this is going to go for 6 years. And so my question to everyone is, what's going to happen after these 6 years? And so either initiating a new phase of the project and requesting more funding, but in interviews, people also express the desire that the government will eventually take over some of these schools and start to extend the services. So it'll be interesting to see, to continue to follow up with that on what is happening to the educational centers.
And I, for my part, was convinced that before thinking about solutions and before continuing that, I would need to build a really solid ground theory to really understand how gender dynamics work in this community. And so I actually hope to go back this coming, the next year in 2015, bringing funding, but also working with Andretta, my host institution, to continue.
I have a question for you. How did you deal with the privilege coming into these communities and without having lived there at any time and being confronted with people who are much older than you are? And then the second point, to which extent did it feel legitimate to be there?
I thought about this a lot, and I think that after studying abroad in Senegal the first time, I thought more about what my positionality would be kind of going back, because it seems like I'm sort of importing for seven weeks my skills, technology, and interests and intentions, and that's pulling out, and that's a very problematic process. But in the context of like my personal life, I am very interested in gender and sustainability, especially in West Africa, and don't intend this to be my last project there. But also kind of came to the conclusion that I needed to engage with this privilege dynamic, that instead of sort of like pulling away from it, I needed to have conversations with people about what I was doing there, about why I was able to do there, and sympathize and have really tough interactions to engage with my positionality in that place. It's definitely something I haven't resolved.
Yeah, I would say on our end, it's something that we talked about every day, and it's something that really wore on us because, like, no matter what mindset you do, the truth of it is that, like, when we flew in, we already had our return ticket booked. We already were planning on leaving, and to try and, like, invest in a community and say that, like, I'm with you in solidarity is really, really hard when, you know, you're leaving August 6th. You know that you're heading out. And so that was definitely challenging.
I'd say for me, one of the largest challenges was the linguistic barrier, and especially because my research focuses on language, and speaking Spanish pretty fluently, I thought if I went to a Spanish-speaking country, I would feel much more comfortable being able to communicate what I was thinking. And in Bangladesh, I was always trying to pick up Bengali, so in any case, I could at least introduce myself and find other ways to communicate. But that was a challenge that I'm still wrestling with, especially when in some of these rural populations, they would also be learning English before even learning their mother tongue. And so many people there spoke English very fluently, most of my interviews weren't, actually all of my interviews were in English, except a couple where I had a translator. So that was, the linguistic barrier was also, and that positionality was something I'm still working on.
For me, like I said, a lot of people kind of just even question the premise of my research. You know, why are you focusing on Christian stuff, assuming Shia stuff is a bigger deal? So that was a little challenging to swallow, I think, you know, coming in with this big, great research plan, you know. But at the same time, I just totally lost my train of thought. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. I'm sorry, I'm just really gonna leave it there. Yeah. lots of things.
I think also with Kendra's project, the Education and Social Justice Research Fellowship, the premise of it is for for students to go to different places in the world where there's usually Jesuit-inspired or Jesuit institutions doing different types of education and work and working at this intersection of education and social justice, to actually come here and in part teach us how it's going on other places so we can rethink some of our practices. So it's not just like a north to south, down, top to down model, but really thinking about how's this working in Brazil, how are they doing healthcare in a Jesuit lens there, in Burkina Faso, what does it look like, in Nicaragua, how are they doing community-based learning at the university there, makes us rethink how we do it in our larger ways. Yeah.
Yeah, to Jordan, I thought it was interesting your point that these satellite channels, I mean, not only are they beaming in, arguments for religion and apologetic type arguments, but they're changing people's notions of identity in Jordan. So like kind of inserting very Western ideas about like religion first as your identity marker. When someone asks you, who are you? Do you say, I'm a Christian, I'm a Muslim, I'm a Jordanian, I'm a member of this tribe? So I was wondering, what's your sense of how that's changing in Jordan? If you were to walk up to an average Jordanian, maybe that's a constructed term. If you were to walk up to someone in Jordan and ask them who they are, and how is identity changing? What would they say first?
Well, so I went into my interviews with some ideas in mind that I'd read in some texts about identity and sort of the main factors in identity. So as I mentioned, nationality, whether you're an East Banker, whether you're from Jordan proper, or you're a Palestinian refugee that now has Jordanian citizenship, or if you're an Iraqi or a person from Sudan or Somalia. I mean, we've got so many of these different refugee populations. So that's a factor. And then, as you said, tribe and religion. And so I would go into the interviews and say, how would you rank these in how you identify yourself, or how you think Jordanians identify themselves? Would they put religion first? Would they put nationality first? Would they put Arabness first? Would they put tribe first? And they told me that in the past, like in the time of their grandparents potentially, they would put Arab first. And Arab sort of included all of those things. It included religion, it included tribe, but it didn't prioritize one over the other. And so now I really don't know what the average answer would be. That was sort of the conclusion I came to in my research after asking a lot of interviewees about the factors of identity. Religion is probably higher up on the list now, but I'm not sure if it would really depend on who you ask. I think people who watch Muslim channels or Christian channels would likely respond that religion is first, but it's really hard to tell.
So my question is for the Caritas project in Bangladesh. So I mean, I understand it's a project that was just a missionary project, I suppose. So I know the indigenous communities that we talked about who live in these inaccessible areas, secluded areas, a lot of them are systematically alienated due to the religious differences. For example, Bangladesh is deeply divided based on religion, and also these tribal communities are systematically alienated by the government intentionally. So as you said, in a few years, the government will take up the streets. So how do you see that interest playing in and the religious differences playing a role in that elimination of the two religions and those schools?
Interesting question. And I think, yeah, so Caritas isn't Jesuit per se, but it is a Catholic organization. And so looking at it in the lens of a predominantly Muslim country was very interesting. And I think that something that the executive director said to me was beautiful, that he said, really our goal is to teach the Buddhist to be a better Buddhist, the Muslim to be a better Muslim, and the Christian to be a better Christian. And there, actually a lot of the indigenous people were practicing Christians, and so they worked a lot through the diocese system, and they had a lot of interaction based on that. And so a lot of the people they worked with were already either Catholic or Christian. And so I don't know what the dynamics will be when the government takes over those schools, but yeah, it'll be interesting to see, because there's also the madrasa system, and then the government, and then the Catholic schools as well. So I don't know the answer to that question.
I have a question for Jordan. Did any of your interviewees cite watching those television shows as a catalyst for dialogue? For example, did any of the Christians you talk to say, yeah, I watched that show, and then I asked my Muslim friends, oh, is X, Y, or Z true about what you guys do or what you guys believe?
Yes, but I don't know if I would call it dialogue. It's more like, this is what the channel said about your religion. Is that true? Like, kind of in more an accusatory way. My interviewees didn't relate first-hand accounts so much to me, but ones that they've heard from their community, or Christians would say, Muslims come up to me now and ask me about the Trinity and about the Incarnation and all these things that really no one cared about before. They didn't care about these differences. It was like, there's the church, there's the mosque, kind of same thing. We wear the same clothes, we have the same language. So I think that, that for example, the Noursat channel, which is from Lebanon, which has a branch in Jordan, what they're doing really promotes dialogue. They will bring Muslims actually on their show and talk about different issues. It's not like the other channels which will maybe have a Muslim on video camera or just like talk about Muslims but not really give them a chance to talk. It's sort of like the Fox News model where you bring in the person just to kind of dehumanize them. I'm really sorry, Fox News. But you know, where they'll kind of come in with their agenda of what they want, how they want to portray the guest. So I wouldn't say that dialogue is usually what comes out of people watching these channels, but in some cases I would hope so, especially with the channel that's indigenous to the region. So.
Margo, any last question?
It seems like all your locations had a lot of very like drastic changes within the span of less than like a generation. So I'm curious how much dissonance you guys saw between the different generations, or like how, especially how young people, if they were more like, you know, the millennials where we don't like care, you know, we're doing it new, it's our way, or if there was sort of more of a acknowledgement of like the way things have been.
I can start. For me, definitely, whether it was in books or in interviews, people said that the kind of grandparent generation and the current young people generation generally had very different mindsets. The younger folks, the younger people might care more about religion and honestly are more insulated in their own communities than you know, rural villagers would have been 50 years ago, where everyone sort of has to like pitch in and is in the community and in the fields and stuff like that. Now today people can, with social media or with television or whatever, you can sort of stay in your little group, you can consume the information that's interesting to you and kind of shut out everything else. So there's definitely a difference there, I think.
I mean, with us, it was pretty drastic in the sense that there's this subtext of the genocide that happened 20 years ago. So, as a matter of fact, there's just an entire chunk of the population that's missing. Now, what's interesting is that you would think that the younger generation might be less impacted by that genocide, and it's true that it doesn't necessarily play on their minds as much, from what we can tell. But still, you have children who are, or people who are 18 years old who have been raised their entire lives by their siblings. It's not an uncommon thing at all. And so, I think there's still a little bit of time until those effects truly start to fade, although it'll certainly going to be international questions.
Yeah, I would say, well, for me, the case would be the Liberation War of '71. And so the people I mostly talked to and interviewed, some of them had lived through that or had memories of it, but I wasn't able to talk to the younger generation about their conceptions of it really in Bengali. But I would say that there was a sense of national pride and maybe not so much in the indigenous and rural areas, but definitely in Dhaka.
And for me, it's interesting because this is something I didn't talk about in my presentation, but climate change has actually reified gender roles in Dunda. And so, hopefully you all will read the paper that I intend to publish soon about this. But the reason for that is that this community used to be a dual farming and fishing community, and women and men were busy all day doing a different variety of subsistence activities. But now, because really the main income generating activity is fishing, women are so much more dependent on men than they used to be before that, and the types of activities that they're engaged in, such as cooking and cleaning and gathering firewood, are just take so much more time and are harder. And so that gender inequality is actually increasing decreased a little bit from what I have been able to see from my COVID interviews. The other thing I would say is that older people in Senegal were familiar with climate change and the idea of climate change, whereas younger people weren't. And they actually said things to me like, you're here researching climate change, well, it's your country that caused that. Or people said, I said, do you know what climate change is? And they said, no. And I said, well, it's about, increasing greenhouse gas emissions, and it's about global environmental degradation. And they said, oh yeah, we've really observed that. I've never heard that word before, but we've observed that. So I think there's definitely stuff that the younger generation can learn from the older generation.
I just want to thank all our